Hi, my name is Phil. I like to talk about politics. In this video, and in the absence of information from the government, what I'd like to tackle here are some of the more confusing aspects of the return to work change in coronavirus policy, to discuss when an employee furloughed at home should and should not return to work. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So yesterday morning, Matt Hancock, the Health Secretary, was answering questions about the new policies. And I mean, I say answering, I need to really stop using that word about ministers because it's never actually accurate. He was listening to questions with a look like a haddock on its way to a fish and chip shop, and asked whether people can be forced back to work even if they fear for their safety. Hancock refused to answer. And this is very much in line with the guidance on the government's own website concerning these new changes in the lockdown. So there's a Q&A from the government, and a lot of the questions are perfectly reasonable questions. They're good questions to put on a Q&A, but in this particular regard, the government dodges the question as well. But there is a fairly simple answer to some of these, at least to this aspect of it, because really there's three aspects to going back to work. One, is it safe to do so, for which there is a simple answer. Two, how do I deal with transport? And three, how do I deal with childcare? So your employer has a legal duty to ensure your health and safety at work. It is actually the top priority in law. Most employers will understand this, even if government ministers do not, or at least do not want to say so. The Health and Safety at Work Act 1974 is your friend in the first instance. Now, most employees should be fine, and most employers would not want staff to return until measures have been put in place anyway, not just because most people are fairly decent, including employers, but because breaches of this law can result in up to 2 years imprisonment and unlimited fines. Except, of course, if you're a Tory donor who owns a construction company, in which case you always seem to get away with it. Now, the advice for any workers who don't work in construction at any rate, who do not trust their bosses, however, is to join a union in the first instance, because the union will have advice for you. And then ask to see your workplace's risk assessment. So you'll know your job. If your employer rings up and says, right, we're going back on Wednesday or Thursday or whenever it is, and you straight away in your mind have thought through some of the potential hazards, and you've not just got to think about you in your own workplace. Let's say it's an office-based workplace and your employer says there's only going to be 3 of you in that office. That's fine for the working. How do you get to that office without coming into contact with others? How do you eat your lunch? How do you go to the toilet? All these sorts of things. Getting into the building at the same time as others as well. So you need to ask what your employer has done about all of these things. You need to see their risk assessment. And your employer has a legal duty to carry that out, so that should not be an issue. So yeah, that question is really easy in terms of, can I be forced to back to work if I don't feel safe? I mean, I don't feel safe is a perception. That in itself doesn't mean you get to stay at home. But has your employer taken all reasonable steps to ensure your health and safety, and have they demonstrated that? In which case the answer is quite simple. If they've done that, yeah, go back to work. If they haven't, no, because they haven't fulfilled their legal duty. But safety at work is just one concern, and there is quite a simple legal answer to that. But again, what about transport or childcare? They're much less easy, and there's nothing at all, or very little I should say, that your employer can really do about that. So with transport, for example, now obviously if you've got your own private car and you can get to work in that private car, that issue is fine. But what if you need public transport? Well, you are permitted to use public transport if it is to get to work. And this is important for those wanting to use it for recreational purposes. You are not allowed to use public transport for recreational activities to get to and from. So although the government have now said you are permitted to travel an unlimited distance for recreation, in England, let's make that clear, this is not the whole of the UK, this is specifically England, that you are only allowed to do that in private transport as long as it is not shared by anyone outside your own household. You are not allowed to use private transport where there's people from multiple households. So, public transport should only be occupied by those travelling to and from work, or to obtain food, medicine, comply with legal obligations, or for some other necessary reason that has been specified by the government. But yes, public transport will be packed. It's all right the government saying, well, if you can't socially distance on public transport, which you can't, turn and face away from other passengers. Have these people never been on a bus or on the tube before? I mean, I have been on the tube once in my life, and even I know that ain't happening. So ignore that. But the fact is, from a legal point of view, you won't be able to use, public transport isn't safe as a reason not to go to work. So basically, you will have to manage that risk. Your employer obviously will have no part to play in that. So you need to take some PPE, a face mask at least. The government is advising face masks, but they're only advising it, they're not insisting on it. So you will find lots and lots of people not using any sort of face covering. So you probably want to think, in addition to that, about some tight fitting goggles on top of that as well, and possibly some disposable gloves. So that also has a simple answer, and although I say a simple answer, it's a simple legal answer. It's not necessarily a simple answer, particularly for people on lower wages, where getting face masks and enough goggles that you can keep disinfecting them at home, and also disposable gloves. They're not cheap, so it's not necessarily a straightforward answer from that point of view, but there is a clear legal position. The government does allow you to use public transport, and so that's not a reason not to go to work. You may still fear for your health in doing so, and if other passengers do not observe social distancing where possible, which of course it's not on public transport, or they don't observe use of PPE, but the government don't care about that. You have no legal right to remain at home on that basis. As far as I can tell, I'm not an expert in any form of law, much less employment law, but that is from what I've found out. Now, childcare is the really genuinely sticky wicket here. Obviously, normal childcare facilities do not exist right now. Schools won't accept your child unless you are a key worker, and you can't get a friend or family member from outside of your household to pop over and look after your offspring, nor can you drop them off at a childminder's home, even if that is a member of your family or whatever. But I also see no way in which you'd have any legal right to refuse to return to work on the basis that you have to care for your child at home. This is a genuinely knotty issue that the government have provided no guidance for that I have been able to read, and faced with the prospect of being fired, I would worry that parents will make irrational decisions about what to do about this. Now, some may be able to come to some sort of arrangement, and they take their child to work with them, and it'd be perfectly safe to do so. It may or may not be a good idea, but that would be one possibility. For a lot of workers, of course, that's not going to be possible. Some will simply have to leave their child at home if they judge this to be safe. Now, bear in mind on this point, and a lot of people have the perception that up to a certain age you are not legally allowed to leave a child at home. That is not actually the case. There is no age at which it's you're legally compelled not to leave a child at home. The law just simply says that you cannot do so if you risk harm coming to the child. So in other words, it has to be based on the capacity of the child to look after themselves. But that is a risk assessment that needs to be done by a parent or parents. It's a sort of law that in many ways reflects the government's own new coronavirus policy. It sort of says, if you leave your child at home and everything works out fine, that's no problem. If anyone complains about it, well, there's nothing the law will do about it because it was fine. But if anything happens to the child, all of a sudden the law will go, you shouldn't have done it. It's one of those situations that is very much left up to the old common sense. Now, I would imagine that the decision that most would have to take in this genuinely difficult scenario would be to drop off any children who clearly are too young or too immature for any other reason at a friend or family member. If it were me, and this isn't advice because I can't give advice on this, but I'd be thinking, it's all right saying, well, I'd have to stay at home, and if they fire me, I'll take them to tribunal later or something. Maybe the law can be flexible about it, maybe it can, I don't know. All I would know is, let's say if I was on an income that paid my outgoings and I knew that universal credit would not, I'm looking at homelessness and all the rest of it if I don't go to work. So I would take it as a certainty. If I'm forced to go to work, I would have to go to work. So what do you do about the child? I would be thinking in terms of this. If there was a friend or family member, particularly in a small household, particularly in a household of one, preferably, that I would trust and that was willing themselves to look after the child while I went to work, I would just do that, whether the rules permit it or not, as being the safest way to look after my child without losing my job. That's just personally what I would think of doing. Another thing to remember, however, is that just because the government announced certain rules and ministers say these are the rules, doesn't mean they're legally enforceable. There's been a lot of debate amongst actual legal experts with some of the rules that the government have laid down with this lockdown, suggesting that they're not all legally enforceable. Now, it may well be, for example, that a full consideration of the law would say that a person facing being fired and dropping their offspring off at someone else's house in actual fact wouldn't break the law. It may be that that rule is not legally enforceable. And I would also say it's probably not in anyone's interest and not the public interest to prosecute that anyway. So, like I said before, you might find that the law is flexible enough. The problem is that the government are not really being clear. They're not helping people understand what to do in this impossible scenario, this genuine dilemma. So, of the three main reasons for a worker being concerned about returning to work, two of them have fairly clear answers. If the employer has carried out a full risk assessment and implemented safety measures to bring the risk down to reasonable low level, then that is not a reason not to go to work. Transport, again, you are allowed to use public transport. So if you have to do that, you may be putting yourself in unnecessary risk from one point of view, but the government will not help you stay at home for that. The childcare is a very difficult situation. The government absolutely need to provide some guidance on that, which they have not as yet at the point at which I'm doing this. All I can say is keep an eye on what that guidance is. Talk to the employer about it, because they may be able to come up with a solution. But ultimately, that is the genuine dilemma there. And it could well be Hobson's choice for some people. But that is the situation as it exists right now. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. If you'd like to support the channel further, then please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.